Brazil and New Orleans, two places containing a rich culture of music, dance, artistic, and celebratory expression. If you look and listen closely, you may be surprised by how similar the two really are. Given their similar complex history, it's no surprise that they share so much. While we could speculate on the many reasons the two cultures have so much in common, it's undeniable that the root of it all pertains to the painful history of the transatlantic slave trade. Due to the slave trade being triangular in nature, kidnapped African peoples were brought all through Europe, North America, the Caribbean, and South America, inevitably picking up cultural influence from the various places along the way. Brazil and New Orleans were both ports of entry in the trade. It's estimated that around 4 million Africans were transported to Brazil, making it the largest importer of slaves in the Americas. Being a city rather than a whole country, New Orleans was tiny in comparison to Brazil. Nonetheless, it became the largest slave market in the United States, ultimately serving as the site for the purchase and sale of more than 135,000 people. Not to mention the state of Louisiana was known to have some of the cruelest and most horrific slave practices in history. In 1808, Congress acted to end the legal importation of enslaved people from outside the U.S. However, it did not end domestic slave trading, effectively creating a federally protected internal market for enslaved people. Unlike many southern cities, New Orleans did not confine its slave trade to a single market structure or even a handful of locations. Instead, slaves were sold citywide. The economy of Brazil and New Orleans vastly relied on slave labor, with their major imports such as sugar, coffee, mining, and cotton all being cultivated by slaves. In opposition to the cruelty and oppression of the slave trade, Brazilians and New Orleanians were some of the strongest to fight back against their circumstances through various rebellions and revolts. Many famous revolts, such as the Malay Rebellion, Caracas Revolt, and the Bahian cycle of slave uprisings took place. In 1811, the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history took place just outside of New Orleans, led by Haitian slave Charles Deslandes. Slaves marched with flags, banners, drums, and weapons as they burned plantations and crops. Later on, slaves were able to establish communities of runaway or freed slaves, with the Quilombos Maroon Society in Brazil and the Free People of Color and Creole societies in New Orleans. Unlike many other places that practiced slavery where segregation and separatism was at the heart of racist idealism, integration and racial mixing was not a foreign concept to Brazil and New Orleans. Although there are ideals behind allowing this differed in ways, the contrast between Creole and mulatto people is similar. In reality, the majority of interracial relations were a product of rape between enslaver and slave. As times evolved, sexual relations between white and black may have occurred for different reasons. Marriage between two races was almost unheard of, though, and relations between a black man and a white woman was consistently punishable by death. As times went on, the presence of mixed-race society became evident in the two places, with the Creole people in New Orleans and mulatto people in Brazil. The reason for this differs, though. Portuguese settlers already had a history with intermingling with the Moors, who were dark-skinned North African Muslims. In Brazil, a mixed racial society was somewhat accepted under the philosophy that the whitening of the population would produce a stronger Brazil. Afro-Brazilians were keen on the idea of mixing with whites in hopes of being provided with better socio-economic opportunity, living conditions, and societal acceptance. This mixing happened almost exclusively in the context of a white man with a black woman. The white wives of these men were also low on the societal totem pole. Thus, their opposition was rarely heard and they could not interfere with these relations. Mulatto children were later presented with much more opportunities, including mobile vocations and advanced education. The term Creole is somewhat ambiguous in nature, but its origins represent the multiracial past and present of New Orleans. Creole translates to native, referring to someone born into Louisiana. However, it is recognized as an ethnicity, encompassing the Native American, African, Caribbean, and white roots of many multiracial Louisianans. Throughout the slave trade, interracial relations were inevitable. Many started with rape, whether that be from sexual lust of the slave master or cruel punishment. In New Orleans, a system known as plaçage recognized white French, Spanish, and later Creole men entered into the equivalent of common law marriages with women of African and Native American descent. The women were not legally recognized as wives, but rather places. Places, either free or enslaved, would live in separate houses from the white quasi-husband, or he would be free to come and go as he pleased. Given the frequency of sexual relations incited upon black women by white men, the Louisiana Code of Law demanded that these relationships be legally recognized. As times evolved, acceptance of intermingling became more prevalent and the mixed-race population grew and grew. New Orleans and Louisiana would become the region with the most prominent mixed-race populations. Similar to Brazilian mulattoes, Creole people were given more access to privilege, in some cases existing in highly educated societies and going on to become esteemed members of society such as doctors and lawyers. Understanding the prevalence of cultural mixing is important in recognizing the diverse variety that characterizes contemporary Brazilian and New Orleanian culture. Upon their arrival in Brazil and New Orleans, enslaved Africans still had vivid memories of their culture. Enslavers attempted to strip them of their practice, but they desperately tried to hold on to it. When looking at the musical and dance practice of New Orleans and Brazil, I noticed a common trend. That's secrecy. Let's start with the practice of religion. The similarities are evident when examining the religion stemming from the Yoruba people, a prominent ethnic group primarily originating from Nigeria, Benin, and Togo. The Yoruba were among the last groups to be captured during the slave trade. Slaves in New Orleans fused practices from the Yoruba religions with Catholicism, forming New Orleans voodoo, which also reciprocated influence to and from Haiti. Existing in a white supremacist and puritanical society, black people had to practice voodoo in secret to avoid punishment. In other places marked by the slave trade, similar adaptations were practiced. In Cuba, for example, Santeria was a prominent adaptation, also producing a rich musical culture in their churches that would influence the Afro-Cuban and even salsa genres. But that could be a whole other video. The stylistic elements of voodoo would later become fashion symbols in contemporary New Orleans music, with outfits being donned by artists like Cyril Neville, Dr. John, and even non-New Orleans artists like Screamin' Jay Hawkins. Similarly, you can see stereotypical depictions of voodoo priests in movies such as Disney's Princess and the Frog. Afro-Brazilians took influence from the Yoruba roots as well with the practice of candomblé, a tradition practiced in slave quarters that utilized African rhythms to express religious devotion to spiritual entities they called orishas. It was disguised as parties to avoid persecution by enslavers. Similar to voodoo, it blended its belief system with other religious sects such as Catholicism and Islam. Notably so, Muslim candomblé members were key participants in many of the liberation movements in Brazil, leading the Malay Rebellion of 1835 in the state of Bahia. Another expressive practice of Brazil was the secret practice of a dance-based martial art called capoeira. In capoeira, two opponents engage in combat to the rhythm of clapping, singing, and instrument playing. Capoeira was a method of self-defense used to train for escape or resisting capture, but it disguised itself as a dance to fool the slave masters. Today it is a symbol of empowerment and resistance in Brazil. Its influence is global, with other forms of dance like hip-hop breakdancing referencing its style. Once again, capoeira is an example of the African diaspora creating distinct cultural practice in secrecy. In 1724, the French implemented Code Noir in the Louisiana Territory, which gave enslaved people Sunday as a day of rest. Enslaved peoples used this day to congregate in remote and public places. These gatherings included singing, dancing, and religious ceremonies, including voodoo dancing and music. As opposed to Protestant colonies, Creole culture was far more lenient on the existence of African tradition. By the early 1800s, free people of color and exiled slaves from the Haitian Revolution and Cuba were a significant portion of the population, bringing more Caribbean influence to the city. Congo Square, now a section of Louis Armstrong Park in modern-day New Orleans, was the first, and for a while, only place where slaves were permitted to sing and play music in the United States. This put a dent in the cycle of secrecy that we discussed earlier, allowing African people to exhibit more pride in their culture than ever before. Classically trained Creole musicians who would later pioneer genres like ragtime and swing took influence from the rhythms that they heard in Congo Square. These genres would later transform into bebop jazz, rhythm and blues, and funk. It is safe to say that Congo Square was the conception site of not only jazz, but contemporary American music as a whole. Congo Square was not only a historical site for music, but dance as well. Slaves were able to openly perform dances similar to the West African ring dances, an art form similar to capoeira, and one which modern second-line dance styles are rooted in.
Congo Square is sacred ground. I mean, this is equivalent to sitting at the foot of the pyramids. This is equivalent to being in the Vatican.
As I understand it, Congo Square was the place where most of the African slaves and free Africans came.
As music, dance, and religion evolved within Brazil and New Orleans, events of celebration began to take shape. Today, Brazilians and New Orleanians alike anticipate the lengthy celebration of Carnival and Mardi Gras, holidays focused around street parading and partying. The two events share similar histories as well, both drawing from Catholic tradition. Mardi Gras, translating to Fat Tuesday in French, is an exhibition of excess and debauchery in anticipation of the strict fasting and penance of Lent. Similarly, Carnival, rooted in the Latin translation of carnivarium, for the absence of meat, is a pre-Lenten festivity as well. Up to this point, we've been strictly talking about the historical similarities between Brazil and New Orleans. On the topic of parades, this is a great segue into comparing the uncanny cultural similarities in modern Brazil and New Orleans. Take a look at the cultural expression of these two events. You'll start to notice many similarities. For one, parade floats are quite representative of each event. In Brazil and New Orleans, people work year-round to craft these grandiose floats, eventually being able to express their hard work and dedication to the holiday and pride in the culture. In Rio de Janeiro, these floats are quite sizable compared to those of New Orleans. Another shared trait between the two events are the elaborate costumes donned by the dancers and parade routers. Comparing the Brazilian pacistas and Mardi Gras Indians, you'll notice the large plume feathers that their dresses are adorned with. While both convey a sense of pride in their nation and city, the main difference between the two seems to be the gender roles in which they exhibit. The pacistas, being mostly female, convey their beauty or sexual prowess, while the Mardi Gras Indians, being mostly male, convey a masculine sense of chief-like authority and high rank within the Mardi Gras society. The fashion of these costumes overtly draws from indigenous cultures as well, whether that be Native Americans or indigenous Brazilians and Amazonian people. Moreover, many of the cultural practices within the parades imitate the hierarchical ranks of indigenous tribes, within different roles and positions being assigned to participants. For example, in Carnival, you have the Rainha, the Queen of Samba, who leads the parade in elaborate costume, the Mestre Sala and Porta Bandeira, a pair of dancers bearing a samba school's flag, and the Carnavalesco, who develops and designs the parade floats and many other roles. Amongst the Mardi Gras Indians, you have ranks like Spy Boy, Flag Boy, and Big Chief.
It's not just the suit, because anybody can put on an Indian suit. You got to know how to play your position. You got to know the game. You got to be taught by a veteran Indian your position and how to play your position. Once you learn and master how to do that, and you put that needle in that canvas and you saw it be on fire every year you put it on, ain't nothing got you can stop. Everybody gonna come look for you.
The first position in the Indian is the Chief Scout. When you first start massing, this is what you are, a Chief Scout. And later, from there, the Chief would point out a position to you, whereas it's spy, flag, or wild man. You know, he said, okay, now use a wild man. I want you to run spy. I want you to run flag. And you get those positions and you keep on running. And that's from the spy, flag, wild man, gang flag, queen, and the chief.
All carrying distinctive roles in the tribe. Without any point of reference, some might say that these acts appropriate these cultures, but in reality, the practice comes from a place of respect and authenticity. As discussed earlier, Brazil and New Orleans have a complex history of intersectional identity, with indigenous blood running deep within Creole and mulatto heritage. At a time, black people with indigenous blood had to hide their heritage in fear of facing even more persecution than they already did. Donning these costumes was homage to their mixed bloodline. This goes back to the idea we have seen regarding a culture of celebration within the confines of secrecy. Now that times have changed and history is celebrated more often than is disguised, we can see people talk openly about this. Look at some of these videos, for example.
In a dazzling sea of sparkle and color, a large float portraying Omama, the creator deity of the Yanomami, one of Brazil's most threatened indigenous peoples, whose Portugal-sized Amazon territorial reservation is the largest in Brazil. The perils faced by this tribe of only 30,000 people, their rich cultural heritage, and the rainforest they protect are this year's themes, chosen by Rio's Salgueiro Samba School.
Salgueiro esse ano vem com enredo.
Salgueiro's samba song is Hutucara, which means in the Yanomami language, the part of the sky from which the earth was born. And the refrain of the samba song is Yate Mishoa, which can be literally translated to I am still alive.
For decades, gold mines.
Why do you think it's so secretive?
Over 150 years ago, when to be a masking Indian in the street literally was illegal. The police department was actually given instructions. They see any black men dancing, parading in any kind of costume that resembles Indians to take them to jail. So our culture has always been built on secretive because we couldn't just be ourselves out of the fear of just being discriminated against, out of fear of black men who actually had native blood being taken away to reservations. So you had to denounce that part of your family, your heritage. So it was kept in secret. So a lot of the words that Indians would use back then, a lot of people didn't recognize the words because the words weren't meant for normal people. It's only meant for me and another Indian, because if you understood what I was saying, it's a possibility you can jeopardize everything.
What is
One popular music and dance style from Brazil, known as frevo, originating from Pernambuco, has many similarities to the New Orleans second line. Out of many genres within Brazilian music, frevo is unique in that primarily consists of horn melodies, as does the second line. Originating from capoeira, frevo's dancers demonstrate moves consisting of high-energy jumps and kicks, all while holding an umbrella, an item previously used as a weapon given its root in martial arts. Funny enough, you'll see umbrellas being paraded in the second lines as well. Not only this, but the New Orleans dance form known as buck jumping, or footwork, shares many similarities to frevo as well. Looking at the traditional ensembles of New Orleans and Brazil, quite a few similarities in instrumentation come up. New Orleanian second lines and Brazilian samba schools have many similarities given the thematic element of large-scale ensembles marching together in unison. However, samba schools almost always consist of percussion exclusively, while second lines usually have 2 or 3 percussive elements, with the majority being brass horns. However, this is not to say that New Orleans music isn't highly percussive. New Orleans music would be unidentifiable without the presence of those signature grooves. Although folkloric in their roots, these marching ensembles had developed into contemporary popularity, still having a strong cultural presence today. Many of the percussion instruments are really just similar adaptations of one another. For example, the Brazilian caixa is almost the same to the snare drum. The alfaia and surdo are similar to the bass drum. The agogo bell is similar to the cowbell, with both stemming from the African gankowe, and the pandero is similar to the tambourine.
Mardi Gras Indian music and a lot of African rhythms, but they were playing some stuff like this.
Eu sou o Elton Moreira Pipa, dar umas pandeiradas aqui quando vocês verem. O material de vocês está muito bom, hein?
As traditional music developed and large-scale ensembles started to shift towards smaller bands, percussion sections were replaced by single drum set players. Nowadays, you'll see a drum set player in most popular musical groups. New Orleans and Brazil had such percussion-heavy music that the drum set player had to demonstrate a lot of independence to make the groove sound authentic to the style. If we look at some of the signature rhythmic patterns people play to signify either Brazilian or New Orleans music, you'll notice many similarities. In many cases, the patterns are actually the exact same, just expressed a bit differently. Many of these rhythms are based off of something called the clave, a staple rhythm to Cuban music but also applicable in Brazilian New Orleans music. Also heard very frequently in candomblé, not surprising given its similarity to Santeria. The clave is a 2-measure rhythm that goes like this. There is a 2-3 clave and a 3-2 clave, defined depending on what comes first, the measure with 2 notes or 3 notes, and vice versa. Take the traditional Brazilian genre known as baião, for example. The baião bass drum pattern is a mutation of the 3 side of the clave, with the accent or defining note being the second note of the 3. Sometimes the third is omitted, but in essence it is a 3 clave. Now take the New Orleans mambo pattern used in second line New Orleans funk tunes like Fire on the Bayou or Hey Pockeyway. It's the exact same thing, a 3 clave.
Good evening.
Let's take a look at a couple other examples of the similarities between baião and second line. Here's a clip of Isaac Jamba, a Brazilian drummer, explaining how to play baião.
Kind of dark. It's not in the morning like, whoa, like samba. You need to sound a little sad to play baião. But I don't...
Now watch famous New Orleans drummer Johnny Vodakovich explain how to play a New Orleans-style street beat. He starts off by mentioning what we talked about earlier, the clave.
I'll play a street beat, and it's focusing around a rhythm like a clave that I stick to and improvising around that. And the clave is a real simple one. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, bum, 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 bum. You know, that simple standard clave, except that it's in a more marching type thing and a looser feel. That's basically the focus, the skeleton of the rhythm. So let me just play a little bit of that and improvise off it.
In some cases, a mutation of the whole two-measure clave will be used as a basis for the groove, moving around and accenting different notes. Many of the rhythms of bossa nova, a contemporary Brazilian genre, are analogous to the snare drum rhythms of New Orleans funk and second line as well. Johnny Vodakovich mentions this in another one of his interviews as well. Let's take a look.
And mess with your head a little bit, like this one. 1, 2, 3, 4. What is that similar to? That's similar to this. Tall and tan, young and lovely girl.
These similarities are no secret. In fact, many drummers talk about this quite frequently in terms of the similarities between the two musical cultures.
I come to find out through the years that all of this music is part of the habanero rhythms, just like beguines and sambas and rumbas, and New Orleans second line music is no difference. It's just play it, the bass drummer just played it in a different spot. And we use the full beat for an accent. 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. Whereas in Brazil, they just play it, you know what I'm saying, like that.
Well, there you have it, Brazil and New Orleans. We looked at the historical experience of these places and how they were shaped by the slave trade, finding themselves and having to adapt and integrate into the societies into which they were displaced. Attempting to hold on to their African roots, many of their cultural practices were kept a secret until they were able to show their pride. Through this experience, Brazilians and New Orleanians alike birthed many cultural staples that maintain a global influence even today. Many of the ideas and themes we see in their celebrations, dances, and musical genres overlap in their similarity. While distinctly different, it is no question that they draw influence from one another. What do you think? Did you see the similarities?